Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, January 10th, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin presenting his In the Headlines lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Angela. Well, welcome everybody and Happy New Year to you all. It's so great to be able to start a year again, to look at what's important in the world, what's going on in our society, to look at some of the headlines in the news, and to try to understand what's going on in general in the world in kind of a whole sense of economically, politically, and just to get behind the depth of what the newspapers are writing about and understand issues of the day in a little more depth. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do. And I usually pick subjects that are featured in the news of the week. And if you are interested in something in particular, just let me know and I will research it and then present it, another time. So we have classes during the month of January, and it certainly is a time when the world is still moving in all kinds of different directions, and where it's important more than ever to understand what's going on in the world, because as we all know, the world is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. We were once able, people at one time never moved more than 25 miles from their homes. They had no way of knowing what was going on in the outside world. They were tied just to their little families and communities. And today, because of the internet and fast communications, it's almost as if the whole world lives in one place. And whatever happens in one place eventually affects something everywhere else. You might have heard of this so-called the butterfly effect, where, if a butterfly flaps its wings in one place, the vibrations of that flapping end up going all around the world. So, it's a good metaphor, but in one way or another, we end up being affected by what's happening all around us. So it's a good thing to understand what's going around us, and also to understand things from different perspectives and not just from one perspective. So 2022, the year that we just finished, was really really an unusual year, and a year of firsts in many different ways. I think for example, it's really the first time in a decade, or more than a decade, that inflation took place in the whole wide world. That we have been living in a climate of very, very low interest rates and very low price raises for so long that we've taken it all for granted. And, of course, those of us who were around in the 1980s do remember where inflation was going at 7 and 8 and even 10% a year. But, 20, 30 years pass and you kind of forget all about it. And all of a sudden, it happened so quickly that the stock markets got shaken, that the banks, central banks all across the world had to raise their interest rates from practically zero to rates which now equalize out to being a 7% loan rate, and consequently people's costs have gone up, and all kinds of other things happened as a result of that. I mean, there has always been inflation in the world somewhere, but usually in failing countries like Lebanon, Argentina, some of the third world countries, where bad economic management or theft leads to devaluation of the currency, and that leads to inflation because people have to buy things at world prices. But for the first time, Europe and North America hit inflation rates of 10%, which is really quite remarkable. So that in that sense, 2022 was a year of first time for that. Following on that, of course, was the first time since 2008 that the world stock markets ended up lower than they started with at the beginning of the year. So 2022 is the first time in 14 years that that has happened. And what's a bit unusual about that is that pretty well the prices of fixed income, like bonds, went down at the same time as the price of stocks went down. And that's really unusual because usually one balances out the other. And this time, because of inflation, the price of bonds went down. In other words, if you're holding on to a piece of paper that promises to pay you 2.5% a year, and all of a sudden somebody else can get 7% a year, then the paper that you have is worth much less because no one would want to buy it from you if they could get 7% somewhere else. So the value of that paper goes down. The value of stocks go down because the recession, because of high prices, people can't afford as much. And so they're not buying as much. So the prices of companies go down as well. And so both of these kind of major investment vehicles dropped in price at the same time. I was just reading one little note that of 1,410 mutual funds, which are actively traded, only 40 out of 1,400 had a surplus, had a positive result in 2022. So it goes to show, in other words, that the whole world's economy went into a downward spiral in that year. And, unless things change drastically in this year, we're probably looking at, some bumpy economic news for 2023. If any of you stuck your nose into the news these days, you will read about the floods in California, which are really kind of once in 10-year type occurrences. California, which has suffered such a drought for so long, is now being bombarded with rain to the point where that water can't be absorbed. And this is all continuing on a whole series and train of climatic events which are so-called firsts ever, or 100-year flood, or 1,000-year fire, or 100-year drought. The climate is changing kind of right before our very eyes, and 2022 is a marker in that way. 2022 featured Europe's hottest summer ever. Record temperatures were broken all over Europe, even in Northern Europe. And you might have seen some news articles about snow missing in Swiss ski resorts. And, they have a picture of a ski lift going up, 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 up. And it's all green underneath. And we're now, of course, in January the 9th. So by this time, of course, there should be snow on the ground in Switzerland. And although climatic change is very slow and it's uneven, it is something that moves all in one direction. And it all adds on, it's accumulative. So that means that whatever happened in years past gets added on to year by year as the world warms up. So we are continuing to experience this, and we can expect more disasters, of course, year by year. Now, we are somewhat, in a certain way, the record temperatures that we've had in the last few years come despite the fact that we've been in 3 La Nina cycles. So what's a La Nina cycle? What's an El Nino cycle? La Nina is the opposite of El Nino. And we were in 2022 was a La Nina year, meaning that the waters of the Pacific Ocean near South America were colder than usual. And that usually does bring a lot of rainfall into the western part of North America, like it's happening now. And it also means that the cooler temperatures than normal would pass over North America. And this was a hot year in North America, despite the fact that we were in a La Nina pattern. And so what that means is when the La Nina goes away, which it will, then the normal conditions will come back, and we might have an even warmer world than we had because of the La Nina pattern. So, that's it's kind of a warning for what could be if the world goes back to its kind of normal state. There is always an alternation between La Nina and El Nino. El Nino is exactly the opposite when the waters around South America get warmer, meaning that the wind is coming from Asia in a west to east flow, and La Nina is where the flow goes back in the opposite direction. So, on one pattern, sort of the Indonesia, Philippine area is cooler, and the opposite pattern, the South America, Peru, Chile is cooler. So that's how it alternates back and forth in a natural way. But right now, this is a La Nina pattern, so it means it's cooler in North and South America for that reason. We've had records, despite the fact, like I said, there have been absolute unbelievable amounts of damage because of climate this year. You might have seen, by this year I meant last year, 2022. Pakistan being covered with water. China also experiencing huge floods. Record heat in India, record heat in China, record heat in Europe. Some records in North America. The hurricanes that we've had in Florida, again, the first deadly ones in quite a long time. And believe it or not, we had a hurricane in Newfoundland. So, who could ever think of a hurricane ever having the strength to reach Newfoundland? Because normally when the water over which the wind passes cools off, the wind then has to drop because it can't hold as much water. And the oceans, the Atlantic Ocean is warming up enough, and the power of the hurricanes to start is so high that it's able to carry itself forward going north, even to reach Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island this year, which both of whom suffered big destruction in Atlantic hurricanes. It's really remarkable that Canada should now have to worry about hurricanes, and it just goes to show, how the climate is changing. But the warmest change above normal happened again, as often happens, in the far north, meaning in Greenland, Siberia, the far northern parts of Canada, of the north of Nunavut. And it means that the ice shield in Greenland is melting so fast that new areas of rocks are being uncovered every year. And it means that tons and tons and tons of fresh water are being melted into the Atlantic Ocean. And this changes the whole sort of pattern of life in the Northern Atlantic Ocean. And, it remains to be seen in a way how this will affect the whole picture of the ocean. But it certainly is something that is worrisome because the salinity levels will decrease in the ocean. The ocean temperature could also decrease because all of that cold water is coming in. It's even possible, and you might have seen the movie in that the flow of the Gulf Stream could be disrupted because of all that fresh, heavy water coming into the ocean. And cold water is heavier than warm water. And so all of that cold water could sink down and push the Gulf Stream in different directions. So, this is an Armageddon scenario. If the Gulf Stream is ever changed, then Europe would, of course, freeze, Western Europe, because at the same latitude, Western Europe is far warmer than Canada is. So, let's say the city of London is far further north than Montreal, but their climate is much milder in the wintertime than ours is. But if that Gulf Stream ever stopped flowing, they would be, exactly in the same Arctic conditions that everybody else would be at that latitude. So these are continuations of things that didn't start in 2022, but are continuing and getting even stronger. The thing that is new about 2022, the thing that was the most kind of changed and shocking, is the war in Europe and the war in the Ukraine, between Russia and the Ukraine. Russia invaded the Ukraine in February 2022. So meaning that this war is now 11 months going. And I would have to say that it's the first real war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. So Europe has had conflicts before. Europe has had conflicts over the disintegration of Yugoslavia and the fighting there between the different former republics, Serbia and Croatia, and then the one between Serbia and Kosovo. But these were small, localized, and really kind of a nature of a kind of a civil war. There are, of course, disturbances in Northern Ireland in the 1980s. But again, this was more of a kind of we'll call it a kind of a civil war, not something of an international type conflict. But the invasion, of course, then there were wars in other continents still going on, but for Europe, this is really a first since the Second World War. And this war, as we all know, has ongoing and continuous serious consequences. The whole economy of the world was in a way disrupted because of it. Oil prices shot up at first because there was a fear that the Russian oil would be removed from the marketplace. Price of gas shot up because Russia said they would stop sending gas to Europe. The price of food shot up because the Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of vegetable oil and of wheat and barley. And the prices of all those commodities shot up because Russia was carrying out a sea blockade against the Ukraine. And Russia itself is a huge exporter of wheat and fertilizer. And the Western world decided to boycott Russia. And so if these items were removed from the Western markets, then of course prices would shoot up for all of those products that are now not coming out of Russia. So it was a huge disruption of the world economic and trading order, a huge disruption in the shipping business, because that's how these materials get from one port to another. And a kind of a call to arms to a Europe that was more or less, we'll say, stable, and more or less not emphasizing military research or military spending or military investment or recruitment of soldiers. And then all of a sudden this threat appears on their doorstep. And the countries in Eastern Europe, especially, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and Moldova, Bulgaria. These are the countries that are kind of next in line to the Ukraine. In other words, they are the next line of defense in a sense of the Western alliance. And these countries panicked justifiably when Russia invaded the Ukraine, because no one knew how far the Russians would advance. No one knew if Russia had intentions of rebuilding its former Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. And, from kind of neglecting military investment, the world completely turned around in 2022 to buy weapons, manufacture weapons, do more research on all kinds of high-tech weaponry, on high-tech drones, on high-tech defenses against cyber attacks, and all these kind of actions, which before were something, not really well emphasized. And now it's kind of the first order of business for a lot of Europe. That war has had huge consequences in terms of migration of people, refugees out of the Ukraine, where now more than 10% of the population has left the country and have found refuge kind of in all kinds of different places. Of course, the economy of Ukraine was completely destroyed, and it's only aid from the Western world which is keeping things going. Russia itself suffered, huge consequences because of the boycott of the West by the country, the migration of people in Russia who are opposing the war, the shutting down of all kinds of free means of expression in Russia, of the media. And so it's really a kind of a spark which really has not yet burnt out, and which shows no sign of ending. So, I mean, we cannot predict today that 2023 will be the end of this war, because no one really knows what the purposes of the war are. Mr. Putin understood at the beginning what he wanted, which was to conquer the Ukraine in a week. But when that didn't happen, no one really knows what he wants now, because the war is at a stalemate. There's continuing losses on both sides. Ukraine would like to, of course, go back the way things were before, but what Russia wants, no one really knows. And what what they would accept, no one really knows either. And so there seems to be no end to this crisis. Now, excuse me, let me just change my spot here a bit. So as I said, this war has unleashed a kind of a river of migration, which has gone all over the place. Hundreds of thousands of migrants have been accepted in Poland, also in the countries neighboring Ukraine, like Romania, Slovakia, Germany, but they've gone all over the place. I wonder if you saw the such interesting newspaper or news article on the town in the lower North Shore called Cote-saint-luc, which is east in Sept-Îles. If you go east of Sept-Îles, where there's no more roads, there's no roads all the way in Quebec from Sept-Îles to the Labrador border. And many of these towns, they existed kind of just on their harbors and on fishing. And slowly they became depopulated because of isolation and better opportunities elsewhere. And so the school in this small little village had only 3 students in it. And the school board said they needed a minimum of 5 to keep the school open. And lo and behold, one family of Ukrainian refugees came there, God only knows why or how, and they had 3 kids. So those refugees were able to keep the school open for another year. And it may be that other families will join them. How they ever got there is beyond me. It's a super mystery. But it means that migrants from the Ukraine and many other places are spreading themselves all around the world. So I wanted to speak a little bit about migration now, this migration crisis that we're experiencing. You know, President Biden went to the US-Mexican border to kind of see what's going on there. And there are tens of thousands of migrants waiting on the Mexican side to cross into the US. And this is one of the biggest political problems that President Biden has. And the migration is linked in some ways to what I began with, which is the climate crisis, because climate has changed so much. In many areas, people can't make a living off the land anymore, and they're forced off the land to go try to find a job someplace else. And that someplace else for people in Central America and South America would be the United States in the main. In Africa, prolonged droughts and over competition for land has led to migration out of the central parts of Africa going northward and trying to get into Europe. And in the political instability and problems in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and even in the Gaza Strip, and the poverty in Egypt, has all led migrants from those regions to try to reach Europe as well. And it has caused political changes in Europe. So the elections in Europe, in Italy, which just elected a far right-wing government, came as a result of this migration pressure on Italy. In France, Ms. Le Pen ended up with some 40-something% of the vote because of her opposition to migration as well. Migrants are coming into Turkey, and from Turkey trying to get into Europe. And I wonder if any of you have seen this movie called The Swimmers. I would super highly recommend this movie, which is about a family of Syrians who try to make it into Europe. And it's such a realistic portrait of what the lives of these migrants are and how desperate they are to get into Europe, and how willing they are to risk their lives to do that. So it's based on a true story. And if you haven't seen it, I really would highly recommend it. So it's called The Swimmers. The flooding of migrants into America has led to political divisions in a way between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans have made very strong points about how America is leaving its borders undefended. The governors of Florida and Texas have been shipping migrants up north to liberal cities to try to show those cities how tough it is to absorb all these people at the same time. And the irony of all this is that we all know, and economists all know, that in the long run, migration is very good for a country. And it's a hard to say sort of which is the chicken and which is the egg. You know, did the addition of migrants make the country better, or is a good country there because it is attracting migrants? So, you know, the birth rates of all of the Western world are below replacement value. The population in all the Western world is aging very quickly. And the demand for labor, both skilled and unskilled, is very high all over the Western world. In the US, there are now two job openings for every person looking for a job. And of course, the person looking for a job doesn't necessarily match the two openings that are there. So, you know, this migration is not in a certain way, it is not like a phenomenon which will deteriorate standards of living in a country. It's something that in the long run improves countries. And of course, in Canada, we all know that so well. And our prime minister said he wants to take 500,000 migrants, but you know, our system is so gummed up that we haven't been able to come even close to something like that. Let me just see here. You know, it's hard to be tough on protecting your borders and compassionate to people who are desperate all at the same time. In the Americas, traditionally there was this flow of migration from what was called the trio of countries: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And those countries are countries which experience extreme poverty, extreme land poverty. In other words, landowners own so much of the land. Governments were ineffective or corrupt or both. And there already were plenty of ties of those people's relatives in the US. So it was like a constant push and a pull at the same time for these three countries to send their migrants to the United States. But now, you know, in 2022, you know, new sort of sources of migration to these refugees have come up in the Americas, and that is from Cuba and from Venezuela and from Nicaragua. So those three countries are all run by sort of left-wing style dictators who have done very, very little to, if anything, to improve their economies, and taking away freedoms and putting people in jail are all, and poverty are all incentives for people to leave. And so, you know, those three countries have contributed greatly to the stream of refugees trying to get into the United States. And it's difficult for the United States to kind of try to treat some people one way and another group of people another way. But, you know, this is part of the dilemma that this government has in the US of what to do with these migrants. And although people have a right to claim asylum on the basis of reasonable fear of prosecution, sometimes it's very hard to differentiate a legitimate asylum seeker from somebody who just wants to improve their lives and their families' lives for economic reasons. So legally, there's a difference between these two groups, but practically there really isn't any. And that's one of the big dilemmas, and will be for 2023. And I expect we'll see plenty of fireworks over what to do with these migrants who are not yet in the US. And then, of course, there's the question of the ones who've already come in. What do you do with those who've come in illegally? You know, is there an amnesty? Is there a desire to send these people back? Many of these children have been born in the US. So many of them have jobs. You know, economically speaking, the country depends on these millions of what are called illegals in the US. Now, Europe is really, although North America and the US is definitely a big destination for migration, Europe is really a bigger one, and Europe has even a more serious problem because there are many more migrants who are potentially willing to go into Europe from Africa and from the Middle East. It's a lot of people there. And in a way, Canada and Australia and New Zealand are geographically so isolated that it's much harder to get to our countries than it is to the US or to Europe. So those are the places that have to deal with this problem and to decide how to deal with it. One of the big questions that Europe faces is, well, if migrants come into the countries, the first countries they're going to come into would be Greece and Italy and Spain, because those are on the southern border of Europe. And should those countries alone be responsible for the migrants, even though those migrants would rather be going to Holland or Belgium or Germany or France? And why should those countries have the cost of receiving those migrants and looking after them? There was almost a kind of a strong disagreement between France and Great Britain this year over the migrants who are trying to reach Great Britain across the English Channel. And so many boats have had people drown in them because, they're taking chances in unsafe boats. And, the question is, should these people be rescued or not? I mean, it really is a whole dilemma for these countries altogether. Let me just see now here. See what else can we have talking about here? The migration into Europe is less of a hot button issue nowadays than it was a few years back, when waves and waves of people were coming across the Turkish border and across the Mediterranean. And one of the reasons that this sort of migration crisis has cooled off a little bit in its intensity is that the migrants who've already made it into Europe have started to integrate and started to fit into the economic system and are providing services and jobs that no one else wanted to take. And the unemployment rate in Europe did go down, as it did in so many other parts of the world, including Canada and the US, where we're almost at record unemployment rates, low unemployment rates, so that there is a demand and a need for workers in that way. And also that the immigrants have successfully integrated over the years to the point where there are many Africans and Indians and South Asians in parliaments of Northern Europe. And you might have seen, that Rishi Sunak is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. There are ministers who are of Indian origin and African origin there in Great Britain. Of course, we have our own cabinet filled with people of South Asian origin. And there was a Prime Minister of Ireland who was an Indian or of Indian origin. So these people, by and large, have been successful. And as 99% of the people are successful, and they're not terrorists or anything like that, but there is a tiny amount of migrants who are terrorists and who commit random acts of terror in Europe and in North America, and this can poison the minds of the general population against migrants as a whole. The World Cup, which took place just recently, if you looked at the pictures of the teams, the ones representing European countries like Switzerland or France or Great Britain or Belgium, they were full of migrants and children of migrants, to the point where, you know, there were more, let's say, African descended people on the French team than there were European descended people. And so since these people are heroes and sports heroes and role models, it tends to soften the opposition to migration, you know, of the local population. If you just excuse me one little second, I want to just check something. I'll be right back. Here we are. Sorry about that. I couldn't keep track of the time for whatever reason. Now I see what it is. So yeah, so speaking about that, you remember, I think last week I mentioned this cancellation of the Hérouville charter against immigrants that was passed, because even you know, as more remote places in rural Quebec, immigrants and migrants are slowly making their way through, and you know, this is just a natural outgrowth of migration, which, you know, may start off in the cities and then is quickly spread out to other areas. The last thing that I will mention, well, another thing that I will mention, well, maybe not the last one, but the election in the state of Israel, putting Mr. Netanyahu back in power in 2022, to me, portends or predicts that the next couple of years will be years of tremendous amount of civil strife in the country. And it's hard to see any positive outlook when you think of who the members of that government are. They have already acted to try to remove any amount of balance or checks and balances that the court has over the government. And so they would like to pass laws saying that the parliament itself is supreme. And of course, what that means is that there is no check on the authority of the government. Since that government is made up of a combination of nationalists, ultra-religious people, religious people, and anti-Arab politicians, there is no coalition partner there to sort of balance off this most right-wing government. And they've already started to take steps to change the country into the pattern that they want it to be. And by doing that, of course, anyone who opposes them is further alienated from from the way that the country is going. And it looks as if the country will undergo some very severe strains in the future. The police minister, Mr. Ben-Gvir, just made a visit to Israeli prisons to make sure that Arab prisoners are not given any more better treatment than they were getting before, and to make sure that they suffer as much as they possibly could. The government wants to stop immigration to Israel of anyone who is not the son or daughter of a Jewish parent. uh, the the visit to the Temple Mount by Mr. Ben-Gvir is a provocation to Muslims around the world in a certain way, because they regard that as their holy place. And if the Jews try to go and claim that as their holy place, then it kind of upsets Muslims all around the world. So Mr. Netanyahu is going to have his hands full. In a certain sense, there's a parallel between Mr. Netanyahu on the one hand and Mr. McCarthy, the head of the Republicans, on the other hand, whereby both these leaders needed their right-wing allies to bring them to power. But once they get into power, they're going to have one heck of a time to try to control the most extreme elements of their coalition or of their partnership. And they are going to end up spending more time worrying about what's going on in their own camp than worrying about the country as a whole or about the opposition. And any of you who watched the election of Mr. McCarthy on 15 ballots in the U.S., has an understanding of how divided the Republican Party is. And if you understand Israeli politics, and the extreme differences between the parties in Israel, and the fact that the coalition is not balanced in any way, will tell you in a way how much trouble Israel is going to face in the future. Among other announcements that they made, they want to say that they want to pass regulations to allow Jewish towns in the Negev to bar Arabs from buying houses in their towns. They want to end grants to cultural events that are not approved by the government. In other words, any cultural events or plays or art shows that don't support the government's line. They want regulations to allow refusal of service to by retailers on religious grounds. So in other words, we've had these cases in the States where a florist won't want to send flowers to a gay wedding, or a cake maker doesn't want to make a cake for a gay wedding. So they want the same kind of privileges to be extended to Israel. But of course, in Israel, it's not just anti-gayness; it's also anti-Arabness. They want to, of course, they announced to stop doing any work on the railways on Shabbat of maintenance when the trains don't run. So that means that they're going to have to do maintenance on the days the trains do run. And increasing billions of shekels for yeshivas, where nothing is taught, where the children of these yeshivas end up with no jobs and no future, no economic future. So we're going to be reading a lot about kind of panicky and scary headlines of what's going to be going on in that country in the future. Now, the other big change of 2022, we'll just maybe finish off with that, is in China. The ending of the COVID provisions was something that happened kind of all of a sudden as a result of demonstrations in China over the excessive lockdowns and the excessive restrictions of people's lives. And those demonstrations complained not only of the restrictions, but of the lack of democracy in China in general, and the wish for the downfall of the government. And that certainly was enough to shock the government to the core and to make the government turn a 180-degree turn on their COVID policies. So up until now, really, China has hardly suffered from COVID and has had practically no people getting dying or getting sick with COVID because of such severe restrictions. And all of a sudden now they've changed completely, because it's impossible to keep COVID in control because of the extreme contagiousness of the new variants. And so because of this extreme contagiousness, it's impossible to lock down the country all at one time. And therefore, they had to just kind of give up. And since people have not been exposed to COVID, and since their vaccines are less effective than the Western vaccines, and since for whatever reason, elderly people were not the priority to be vaccinated, and the reason for that was that the government felt that they didn't want their workers to get sick and be off the job, and since elderly people didn't work, they didn't need them so much. The fact is, of course, that elderly people are far more prone to severe illness. And now that the sort of lid is off, there will be many, many more severe illnesses going on. The thing about China is that their medical facilities are not nearly as advanced as the Western ones. There's not nearly as many as them. There's not as many skilled people. There's not as much equipment in the hospitals to, like ventilators and oxygen and all that other things that you need to treat COVID patients. And so they're going to undergo, 2023 is going to be a real test of the Chinese system to see if they can cope with, a kind of an outbreak of COVID. But as we know from, 3 years of having COVID, the sort of wave does not stay constant. In other words, the wave goes up and the wave goes down, and then it may go up again and down again. And so this initial bout of COVID that China is going to suffer now probably won't last. And it'll be something that as more and more people get COVID, there's less and less people left who are there to catch it. And then if their vaccination can catch up with the with the demand, then they should be okay, in the longer run. Of course, we don't know about COVID itself, what new variants it could throw at us. And we have a new one now called the XB 1.5, which is different from the Omicron 4 and 5 varieties, and this new variety is supposed to be more contagious than even the old ones. And so it's pretty well clear that I would say, at some point or other, 95% of the whole world's population will end up catching COVID. And, the vast majority of these people will not be seriously affected. And so this built-in immunity will be building. So that, but the sort of challenge that China faced and is continuing to face is that people will say, well, if the government knew everything and they thought that locking us up was the right idea, how could they possibly change their minds all in 1 week? And it means they don't really know what they're doing. And in that sort of criticism is one which the government will have a hard time to, to kind of explain away. What else can we say? Just to point out, in finishing, the riots in Brazil that they're just finished happening now are a direct copy of the January 6th insurrection in the United States. And it was, in fact, the very same people who were backing both of them, Steve Bannon and those kind of people, were encouraging the Bolsonaro losers of the election to riot and to try to invade the Capitol and to try to get the army to come in and intervene and take power. But the army stayed out of it, and the government got control again of the Parliament buildings, and it was ex-President Trump himself was encouraging, was doing everything he could to support this movement. Mr. Bolsonaro himself is now in Florida, and he did exactly the same thing as Trump did in not conceding the election and not shaking hands with a newly elected president, with not handing over the presidential sash, with not wishing the good luck to the new elected leader. And so sowing discontent in the country, sowing doubt on the election process, dividing the country exactly as Mr. Trump has done. So, in a certain way, this sort of poor sportsmanship and has really strong effects for the health of the country. And the United States, as we all saw, is still divided along those lines. 2023 will also tell us whether Mr. Trump will be successful in his re-election bid to head the Republican Party, and also we'll find out probably if Joe Biden we will find out if Joe Biden wants to run again or not in the American elections that are scheduled for 2024. I just wanted to finish completely different subject with something that I read now, and I'll finish with this. And I was reading an article on how this Dutch company has invented a kind of a cement which heals itself by injecting bacteria into the cement when it's being made. What happens is that these bacteria are in a way frozen in place, and the moment that they get wet, these bacteria will make spores, and these spores will fill in the holes of the cement that has deteriorated. So it's a sort of a self-healing type of cement. And the articles that were published about this, I just happened to read one this past week, saying that this company has already been in business for a few years, and that the process actually works. So I said, wow, that's such a great idea, because we have such problems, especially in freezing weather and in areas of salt penetration into cement that deteriorates it and rusts out the rebar that's inside of it. And, that's why that condo collapsed in Florida that we were hearing about. In a certain sense, that's why the Champlain Bridge deteriorated to such a great effect after only 1960, 80 years, 70 years, 80 years, the bridge was finished. And so I said, well, this is a good sign for how technology can solve the problems of the future. And then the other day, I started reading an article, and the article was saying, why is it that Roman constructed projects have lasted for 2,000 years out of Roman concrete? And the Romans built the Pantheon in Rome. They built aqueducts all over the place. They built the Colosseum. And these buildings and bridges and water courses are 2,000 years old, and they're still being used. And how is that possible? So the article was saying, well, the Romans did discover this great system, in a way by trial and error, of mixing volcanic ash in with the cement. So cement, is made of limestone, which is heated up along with sand and water and gravel, and that makes concrete. And the Romans added in volcanic ash, and the volcanic ash acts as in the same way in mixing water in the right proportions, and the volcanic ash acted the same way as this bacteria that we talked about, and that when it does get wet, it expands. The ash expands and it fills up the cracks in the cement or in the concrete. And that's why the Roman, structures have lasted this long. So imagine something that they figured out 2,000 years ago, which has only been in a way reformulated in the last few years. That would be quite amazing. And the other thing, sort of again, sort of a mystery, was they had a picture of Tutankhamun's knife or sword. And this was a beautifully constructed knife, a kind of a dagger, I would call it. And it was made of iron. And there was no iron in Egypt in those days. No one figured out how to smelt iron ore. I mean, iron ore is just, rock, but you can't make a perfect knife. You can't make iron out of iron rock. It's the rock is just ore. It's not the iron itself. And it has to be heated to a huge high temperature in order to get the iron ore to solidify to become iron. And the mystery was, well, how could he ever have gotten such a knife made of iron when there was no iron? And so researchers were looking at this thing under a microscope. And what they figured out was that this was made from an iron meteorite that fell somewhere. And the meteorite was taken to the royal palace, and it was shaped there into a knife. So I thought that was kind of interesting to see how that happened. Anyway, it's 3 o'clock, so I want to stop now and to see if there's any comments or questions. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in, because it's such a pleasure to speak to you, and to invite you to come up with questions and comments. Next month, I'm going to be traveling to India and Nepal, so I might do a class on India, because India is, and it could well be that this year, 2023, will be the year that India becomes the largest country in the world in population, after China was the leader for so long. And India is also one of the countries which is the probably one of the fastest growing countries in the world in an economic way. And, because China closed itself down and closed itself off from the rest of the world, and India didn't, then India has taken up a lot of the work that China was doing. And certainly some parts of the country have become as westernized and as prosperous as anywhere else in the developing world. So we may speak about that. We'll see. So questions, comments. What I did was kind of go over the big stories of 2022, looking forward to 2023. And, of course, who knows? No one can foretell the future, but, these are continuing stories that will keep our interest going. So Angela, you tell me what you got there if someone has a question to ask, and I'll be glad to comment on it.
Okay, so I see Miss Aviva. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, yeah.
To Mr.
Hi,
Dwoskin.
Aviva. Hi, Aviva. You have to unmute yourself at the top of your iPad. You have to sort of hit the bar on the top that says mute and hit it, and it'll become unmuted.
Sometimes it's on the bottom.
Oh, sometimes on the bottom? Okay.
Yeah,
well,
depending on what you're using.
Okay.
I see
I
Sharon.
don't, it's
Oh,
all
there
right.
you
I don't have a question.
Oh, I could hear you very well now. I could hear you very well. Oh.
I can say only that I'm glad you're back, and I enjoy your talks very much.
Well, I'm very glad you're listening, because I don't know if I've ever told all the students who listen how I got into this teaching in the first place. And I've always, from the time I was 4 or 5 years old, I was always interested in history, politics, languages, world geography, and all this kind of subjects. And 2023 will be 53 years that I have been living with my wife, who is basically not interested in any of this. And so when I would come up with a point and start explaining it to her, she would say, oh, no, never mind. And so, okay, it's like as if I had all this bottled up in me. And at one point in the 1970s, the Golden Age Association, which was called then the Golden Age Association, and now it's Cumming Center, they were looking for someone to teach current events. I said, wow, this is exactly what I'd like to do. So that's how I got started. Maybe if my wife had listened to me, I wouldn't need another audience. Yeah. Anyone else have any ideas or questions? For example, Aviva, were you watching the TV on the selection of the Speaker of the House in the on the American television? It was kind of almost like sports. In other words, it was like you're watching a game go by from the beginning to the end.
Mostly, I'm concerned. Do you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Mostly, I'm concerned about the effect of events in Israel on the campuses and the population of the Jewish population in North America. I think it's very serious and we have to deal with that.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I could predict is that, and this is a continuation of what's been happening, is that there will be a greater emigration from Israel, people leaving Israel because the atmosphere in the country is going to be so unpleasant that people who are of a secular nature or who are of a left-wing nature won't feel comfortable in the country anymore and will just leave. Now, you know, where they go to is where they have family connections or job possibilities. And North America is certainly one of those places. And there are already something around at least 500,000 Israelis living in North America, at least at this point. So I think we will get more of them coming. But I think you're referring to we'll call it the persecution of people in academia who are pro-Israel, and the kind of closed-mindedness of parts of academia to ideas that are pro-Zionist, and that certainly is a factor that's happening in the States and in Canada. And there's only one good thing to be said about it, and that is that it's the people who are against that are organized and are able to fight back, not always successfully. But in Canada, we have the CIJA, Canadian Institute of Jewish Affairs, and we have the organized Jewish community who are, paying attention to what goes on campus and who are publicizing all of the so-called misdeeds of, academia in this area. Sometimes that doesn't have any effect, but it certainly did have an effect just in something I was reading this past week over an appointment of, where was it now? I can't remember which university it was. But they wanted to appoint somebody from the Human Rights Watch, which is a kind of a very strongly anti-Zionist organization attached to the UN somehow, and to appoint that person who happened to be Jewish a post in academia, and the university said no, because they just didn't want the all the bad publicity that came with it. And people who donated money to the university say, well, look, we don't want to support this kind of ideology in our university. So it's not as if it's certainly true that anti-Zionism and anti-Jewish feelings exist in lots of parts of North America and in the academic world. It's also true that doesn't go unanswered, that there's people out there who are fighting this and publicizing it all the time. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Well, you expressed it very well, and I thank you.
Okay, thank you, Aviv. Thank you for listening. I look forward to having you listen, for much longer. And I wish you a happy new year also.
Same to you.
Okay. Anyone else?
There is a comment from Boris that says, very good analysis of the last news. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Boris. Thank you for listening. I love to have people who comment and people who listen and appreciate, how things are. And I always felt that it's not enough to be an expert in one tiny little thing, in academia. Because the academic world is so broad and because there's so many scholars and so much competition, there was a tendency at one point to be more and more specific in the work that's being done in research. And so, you might get something on, English country life in Norfolk area between 1861 and 1862, that kind of specificity. But you lose the forest from the trees if you go and only concentrate on one thing. And I'm a kind of person who says you have to try to understand everyone and to make sure you understand that also people, by and large, my belief is, by and large, most people in the whole world want the same things. They want health, happiness, and a good life for their families. And there's very few of them who are obsessed by trying to make their lives out of destroying somebody else. And these people, unfortunately, do exist, and they have to be defended against. But most people are not in that way. And sometimes prejudice, we're brought up to feel prejudiced against certain groups for no realistic reason. And that's what prejudice is. It's prejudging. And to me, that's one of the worst things that can happen. You don't understand somebody until you can put yourself in their shoes, basically. So that's it. Anything else?
I don't see anything else,
No?
Mr. Dwoskin.
Okay, so in that case, I want to thank everybody, and I want to thank you, Angela. I hope you had good holidays, and I hope to see you again next week.
Thank you. Happy New Year, Mr. Dwoskin. I forgot to mention it earlier.
Happy New Year to everyone.
And
Let's
Happy
hope
New Year.
Let's hope it's a good one.
Yeah, and Happy New Year to everyone listening in over the telephone and online. And we shall see you all next week. Have a
Thanks
good rest
again.
of your day.
Bye.
Bye.
Done.